This presentation is going to be integrating and citing secondary sources. We'll also cover primary sources, what that means, and how to include it into your essays. Now, what are secondary sources? And if we're talking about secondary sources, then shouldn't we talk about a primary source first? Well, we will briefly, and that comes a little bit later. But in short, your secondary sources consist of the research materials that you gather about your essay's main topic or argument, sort of the research that you do, whatever you conduct, the materials that you bring to the conversation, that will be your secondary source material. Your essay's topic will most often focus on one or two texts. These texts are what we consider the primary sources, but some writing that we do, especially if it's from an argumentative standpoint, it may not always have a primary source text. It may just be the idea that we're working from, and we use these outside secondary sources to contribute to that argument. Secondary sources offer valid commentary on the primary source material if that material is used. And I'll explain in a little bit what that means. But basically, when we have the the primary source material, the secondary source material is sometimes a commentary that enhances or enlightens or explains what the primary source was about. The secondary source will do that. Some examples of primary and secondary sources. If we're writing a restaurant review for our essay, the primary source might be our own personal dining experience. So that's not necessarily a text, it's an event, something that happened to us, information that we gathered specifically or directly. The secondary source could be other published reviews written by food critics about that particular restaurant. If we're wanting to write a critique of Angela Carter's short story, The Company of Wolves, then our primary source would be The Company of Wolves, because that's the story that's being focused on, the article or the essay or story that's receiving the most attention. It's the focal point of the essay because it's a critique on that story. Our secondary source would be a critical essay about The Company of Wolves. Someone else who's written a critical commentary that was published about The Company of Wolves, maybe a particular angle, examining a particular character or a motif that's taking place in the story. If we wanted to write a topic on encouraging organ donation, if I want to make sure that people go out and donate their organs when they pass, the primary source, I may not have an actual source text, but the primary source could just be my own argumentative position that I want people to do this. But then secondary source material I have to compile because that could be the data from the American Red Cross about the benefits of having more organ donors. Why are secondary sources needed? Well, we've talked about this before if you've looked at the other presentations. You want to have a balanced rhetorical triangle with ethos, pathos, logos. Logos being well organized, pathos being that the essay creates an effective connection with the audience. Ethos establishes credibility, and this is why we need those secondary sources, because we want to either establish credibility through personal experience or through qualified sources when we don't have the experience ourselves. So those qualified sources are needed so that we can have a more credible essay. How do I prepare a secondary source for inclusion in my research essay? A lot of people think that all we need to do is quote. You just pull quotes and put quotes and don't worry about it. But there's another time you can also paraphrase. And I think some students want to include quotes and not worry about paraphrasing, but there's actually a reason to do both. You shouldn't always quote, you shouldn't always paraphrase. There are reasons why you do each. You want to quote if the language that you're pulling from the quotation, if it's very vivid and expressive, if it's very clear and concise, if it's something that you really want to have an impact, then you want to pull directly from the text to do that. You also want to quote if the exact wording is needed for accuracy or to validate the writer's authority. If someone's definitely said this and it's very powerful, then you definitely want to include that as a quote and not a paraphrase. Also try to quote if the choice of words is so unique that to paraphrase would result in a loss of meaning or effect. If something's just so powerful, there's no other way that it could be said that it would be this great, then definitely quote the information. But paraphrasing needs to be considered as well, and sometimes I think paraphrasing can be more important than quotation marks, or not quotation marks, but inserting a quotation. You want to paraphrase if the passage is too lengthy to justify a direct quotation. You don't want to have a 10-line quotation that a 10-line quote that takes up that much of your paper. So if it's not vivid, expressive, if it's not very exact or precise, if it's just a huge passage, then you want to try to sum that up as quickly as possible and just paraphrase it. You can always pare down a paragraph into a sentence to get the meaning out of it. That would be a reason to paraphrase. You also might have key points from the text that are interspersed amongst information irrelevant to your essay's argument. For example, you may be reading a page of information and maybe the first 2 sentences are relevant and 1 sentence in the middle and 2 sentences at the end, but then you have 6 sentences separating all that information around it and in between that you don't really need. So you don't want to have to quote all of that information. So what you can do is just pull those key points together that you need for your essay's topic, pull those together into one succinct paraphrase that you can insert into the text. Also, you paraphrase when the information is valuable, but it's stated so generically that to quote directly would be superfluous. You don't want to quote just to quote. Sometimes it's better to show that you can paraphrase because it takes the writer's, it shows that you as a writer are able to process someone else's words and turn them around and put them into your own words to show that you actually have an understanding of what's being said. So there are times to quote when the language is really perfect, when it's just there's no other way to say it that's going to get it out as clear and concisely as this, and then there are times to paraphrase, and that's the examples over to your right. Now that you've got your secondary sources obtained, once you've gone out and found what you need, what do you do with that? Because with your secondary sources in hand, you start placing them into your essay. You try to build your ideas around it. But as you construct your essay, you want to be very careful that you don't overload it with too many sources, because that can kill your own authority. You want the ideas that come on the page to be your own, and your secondary sources or your quotes, your paraphrases, to support the idea that you're presenting, not carry that idea. So if we've written the first paragraph in this format and we start out with a paraphrase, and then I have my own original sentence, and then I throw in a quotation, and then I throw in 2 more paraphrases, and then I throw in my original sentence, quote, paraphrase, and I keep doing that throughout the paper, do you see how the paraphrase and the quotation, those 2 things are taking over that paper, and the more that I use that, the more my original sentences become weak and they start to disappear until by the very end you can barely even see what I've said, because the quotations and paraphrases are overpowering your original idea. So you don't want to do that, because that creates a very big problem. We don't want to create a monster. Think about Frankenstein's monster. He was constructed completely of old parts that were stitched together, kind of like that essay that I showed you before, where all these paraphrases and quotes are stitched together around a few little ideas of our own. And Frankenstein's monster, he frightened everybody. Nobody really understood him. The same can be said of an essay with too many sources in it and misplaced sources. You're going to have something that frightens everybody. Nobody's going to understand what's happening to it. And what we call that in writing, or what I've always called it, is Frankenpaper. And you don't want to have Frankenpaper. This is the place where if I had a soundbite, I would have the Bride of Frankenstein screaming over there when she sees it. No, we don't want this. You can't have this in your essay. So how do we avoid that? You need to use something that I call the evidence sandwich. Rather than lump your source material together, I want you to separate it effectively and by using it as evidence. And then we're going to sandwich the secondary sources around our own ideas within each paragraph. And that way we have more ideas from us than we have quoted material or paraphrased material. Here's the process for constructing the evidence sandwich. The first thing you want to do is compose the topic sentence, and if necessary, you may need to have additional sentences to clarify the direction that topic sentence is taking the paragraph. Okay? But once you've established the position, then it's time to show some outside evidence, something to support the idea that you're trying to present. And to do that, that's where you introduce and present your evidence, and that will include a signal phrase along with your quote or paraphrase. Now, if you don't know what a signal phrase is, don't worry about that. We'll talk about that in a few more slides. But step 2 is where all that information gets inserted. You're going to put in your evidence in that position. Then in step 3, and this is a step that a lot of people forget when they're composing those paragraphs, that's where you want to offer an analysis to explain how and or why the evidence supports your topic sentence and overall claim, and also how it ties back into your thesis statement. All right? If you follow this format, then you'll always have your ideas, or which are in black here. There are 2 times that you'll be writing from your personal view, and only 1 place where you'll have an outside source within each paragraph. So if we do that, then you've got an average of 2 to 1, a ratio of 2 to 1 rather, of your work versus someone else's. Here's an example. This is a restaurant review, and these are from essays that were submitted by former students. At first I was skeptical of Nori Nori's buffet because of the enormity of food, but it turned out to be a perfect choice for a great lunch. The food critic of Sandy Springs Now, an online local guide, also appreciated the restaurant's buffet, noting that it was not only satisfying and filling, but he did not have the urge to take a nap. This is critical when you have 4 to 6 hours left in your workday. The food selection on the buffet consists of lighter fare, and like Davenport, I did not feel tired or sluggish after my tasty meal either. Now you see in red I have the quote that's been sandwiched in, or not the quote here, but it's sort of a paraphrase, a signal phrase that builds into the quote. So we have our quotation built in, and we have his ideas, the writer's ideas, surrounding the quoted material and the signal phrase. So you see how it's nicely sandwiched in. If we're going to examine the source and pull it out, you have the food critic of Sandy Springs Now, an online local guide, also appreciated the restaurant's buffet, noting that it, and this is your quotation that's prefaced by a signal phrase. The part in blue is the signal phrase. The signal phrase might also be called an attributive tag, but what it is it leads into the quote, because you don't want to just drop in a naked quote. And a naked quote is just where I take a quote and just plop it into the sentence, and I don't give you any sort of setup or lead in. But this justifies who the food critic is, or who the person quoting is, justifies him as a food critic, so that gives him credibility to talk about the subject matter. Okay? And if you look down here at the bottom, I only cite Davenport's name because the parenthetical citation lists only the name because the source was obtained online and had no numbered paragraphs. And according to the MLA guidebook, that's how it would show up there in that situation. You'd only have to list the name. Why use signal phrases? I want to talk about that a little more carefully. To establish a transitional boundary between your words and the words of your source material. Because you, like I said, you don't want to just plop a quotation in there, or you just don't throw a paraphrase without setting it up. You always want to set it up by letting someone know this is who the person is that said this. This is the credibility that that person has. And you do that with just a short phrase, build it in, and then nobody questions that that person is credible enough to talk about that particular subject. You also do it, like I said, to prevent a naked quote. Do not put naked quotes in your essays. Never put a period that concludes your words and then start the next sentence with a quotation mark that you insert a quotation, close it, put another period, and then start with your own words again. You always need to set up a quote. You always need a signal phrase or an attributive tag to lead someone into a quotation. The signal phrase, like I said before, it also establishes that outside authority by letting a person know, letting the reader know who the speaker is and what gives the speaker the right or the credentials to talk about this particular topic. Just like we saw earlier, it was a food critic. The first time you reference a source, you should always include a signal phrase. This will qualify your source. And by source, I mean whenever you're using that source material, whoever it's going to be, it always came from someone who has written it, so you always need to include the signal phrase to reference who that person is. You know, give that person some sort of qualification for discussing the information at hand. And always use their entire name the first time, and then after you've referenced them by their entire name the first time, after that you can reference them by their last name. Okay? Don't ever use just their first name unless you know the person personally and you're on a first name basis with that person. And chances are you won't be. So always reference them by their last name. Evidence sandwich example 2 is a literary critique, and this is a paragraph taken from a literary analysis or literary critique written about Angela Carter's Company of Wolves, and references Red Riding Hood as well. Readers may be surprised to discover that a fairy tale like Little Red Riding Hood, thought to be intended for children, carries sexual undertones within it. But by examining Angela Carter's retelling of the story The Company of Wolves, a reader will instantly notice the heightened emphasis on the female protagonist's sexuality. Carter, however, offers in her story only those elements that were already present in the older fairy tale. According to scholar James McGlathery, Little Red Riding Hood's admonitions to protect the goods she carried while avoiding straying from her path all imply the dangers of losing one's innocence and virginity. Retelling stories, as Carter does, may appear to offer new viewpoints on the subject, but in this case, the author has only reiterated the fairy tale's underlying message of protecting one's sexual innocence. And that's a big paragraph, but you see in the green there, that's the paraphrase, and you see how it's such a small amount of information compared to the wealth of information that the writer has contributed that consisted of her own ideas. That beginning part sets up everything, lays out a good topic sentence, explains the strategy that she's taking in that paragraph. McGlathery's paraphrase simply reemphasizes or reiterates or supports the idea that she has, and then the writer comes back in afterwards and explains how that information that's been presented justifies what or upholds, supports the information that she started out with. If we examine that source, according to scholar James McGlathery, that's our signal phrase. Because the author is named here within the phrase, the last name is not required in the citation. If you see down here below the citation, 67. If we hadn't mentioned McGlathery's name, we would have in the quotation McGlathery 67. The source is paraphrased, therefore no quotation marks should be used, but credit still must be given. If we paraphrase someone else's work, we have to give that person credit. So no quotation marks with paraphrases, but we do still leave a citation. Without the author's name in the signal phrase, and like I said before, the citation would look like what you see above McGlathery 67. Now, when we quote, we always want to put quotation marks around the statement. However, there are special forms of quoting that I want to discuss because these will come into play as we write. One aspect when we have to quote, sometimes we need to use brackets, and that's when our own words are needed inside the quotation to add clarity or make the statement connect grammatically to our sentence. Because as we write a sentence, when we stick a quotation in there, sometimes the grammatical structure of the quotation or words within the quotation won't match up. If it's a subject-verb issue or pronoun-antecedent agreement issue, there may be some sort of grammatical dilemma between the statement we're trying to write and the quotation. So when we do that, sometimes we have to tinker with some of the words inside of a quote. And when we do that, we have to put brackets around the parts that we've tinkered with because we want a quote to be specific and exact to what we pulled from the text, the article or the book that we obtained it from. But showing brackets around words will show that we have made some changes. So if our original statement is, in this situation, she gains in her reflection what she does not possess organically, if I want to include that in my essay, I may put my attributive tag or my signal phrase to say, as Perry Meisel suggests, she gains in her reflection what she does not possess organically. And you see what happened is, because I have to lead off my quote with a capital, the quote itself is not capitalized up there. She gains is in lowercase, but what I did is just put a bracket around the S to make it uppercase, but I had to show that I did that, and I made that change. Another option is to say, as Perry Meisel suggests, Mrs. Dalloway, who the she is referencing in the story. If we don't know who that is, then I may need to include her entire name. And if I do that, I put that in brackets as well. The ellipsis mark, that's used when we want to indicate that we've condensed a quoted passage. What remains, though, must be grammatically correct. And typically that shows up in the middle. If we've got the beginning of a statement and the end of a statement that we want to use in a quote, but the middle part of that sentence doesn't work, and we can take it out and it still maintains some grammatical integrity, then we use the ellipsis mark to show that. And so if the original was, she could see what she lacked, it was not beauty, it was not mind, it was something central which permeated. In the essay that we have, we may want to construct it to say, Virginia Woolf writes that Mrs. Dalloway could see what she lacked. It was something central which permeated. And so you see how we've edited out that sentence a little bit. We've removed those middle sentences, and to do that, we put the 3 ellipsis mark the ellipsis mark rather, which is the 3 dots. However, this one has 4 because it still has to be grammatically correct, and that ends a sentence, and we want to put the extra dot to show the period before we begin the next sentence. It was something central which permeated. The other form of quoting is block quoting, and that's what we use when we're going to offset more than 4 typed lines of prose or 3 lines of poetry. Now, indenting the quote 1 inch, which is either 10 spaces or 2 tab keys from the left margin, that creates a block quote. So I may write it to say this. If I'm writing, I say Mrs. Dalloway views and admires her surroundings. And then everything after that you see is the block quote. That actually came from the book, from Mrs. Dalloway. And I've cited it at the bottom as being from Woolf, and it's on page 11 because the book Mrs. Dalloway is written by Virginia Woolf. But I've used the quote. You see how it's all lined up. All the lines are indented. There are no quotation marks because the fact that it's block quoted shows that it's a very extensive quote. And another rule here, if you look, when you have a block quote, it's a little different because here the period comes before the citation. You've got ice block period and then Wolf 11. In a regular quotation, anywhere else, you would have the quotation marks where the period is here, and then the period would come after the parentheses. Okay? Here's some rule of thumb about block quoting, though. You want to reserve that for very special circumstances. Using it too frequently within an essay can weaken the credibility of your own valuable ideas. A 3 to 5 page research essay should not include more than 1 block quote, if any at all. If you have block quote after block quote after block quote, that's letting other people talk. It's becoming Frankenpaper. Okay? Be sure to document all your sources correctly with in-text citations. And because all sources are not created equal, when you're preparing your in-text citations using the MLA format, your source material may not fit precisely into the 2 models that I've shown you. I gave you an example from Carter's Company of Wolves. I gave you another from a restaurant review. So everything may not fit because sources often vary. They're different. What you need to do when you're unsure of how to cite or source, when you want to create citations for your sources, if you're unsure, always consult your textbook and or your writer's handbook. Most colleges assign a writer's handbook at the beginning of the, in an 1101 class. You should hang on to that handbook through, or an English 101 class as well. Hang on to that handbook for the rest of your college career because it will always help you with MLA and APA format styles. But look in that and see if it tells you how to arrange or sort your citation. If you're not sure and you're one of my students, please come see me for assistance. If you're watching the YouTube videos and you're not one of my students having a crisis, feel free to email me through YouTube. So here are some reminders from the presentation. Sources should always come from credible material. Be sure that you're getting credible sources from the right places. Best obtained through our library system. However, internet sources are good as well if you give them a good credibility check beforehand. Okay? Quote only when necessary. Paraphrase whenever possible. Use the evidence sandwich to avoid Frankenpaper. Include signal phrases to transition into source material. Include a parenthetical citation after each source used. Remember, we want to avoid plagiarism. Use ellipsis, brackets, and block quotes as needed, though we could use block quotes very sparingly. If you're still in doubt, come and see me. And if all of this goes well, then you should have a good, happy writing experience. Thank you for listening.